Chris Johnston, Sportsnet, Hockey Night in Canada. We're in Las Vegas, T-Mobile Arena. The Toronto Maple Leafs are going to play the Vegas Golden Knights here tonight.
Great place to be.
I know. You've been covering the Leafs for the last decade, pretty much?
Yeah, even longer.
Even longer?
Yeah.
And you go to every Leafs game, you cover them at home, you cover them on the road, and has been doing so for a couple of years.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting phase for the Toronto Maple Leafs right now, going from a talented team to becoming an actual contender, which they could in theory already be. There are so many Swedes on the team and in the organization, whereas the biggest story was William Nylander for a long stretch of the season. But now, really, isn't it Andreas Johnsson that is actually the biggest Swede story of the Leafs this year?
I think you could say that. I mean, certainly Andreas has probably performed a little better than he thought he might in the NHL. I mean, you never know. He had a call up at the end of last season. He played well in a small number of games and a little bit in the playoffs. But when you have that full year, you don't always take the next step. And, for him, in fact, I think that there's a lot of people around the Leafs that are hoping he plays even higher in the lineup than he has now, because he's performed so well lately and put up a number of points, even being on the fourth line at times. He's a player that, as we're getting close to the trade deadline, other teams are hoping the Leafs, might trade. And I really don't believe they would do that just because he's become so valuable to what they are.
Speaking of trades and contracts, obviously big news the other week, Austin Matthews signing a new contract. Just before Christmas, on December 1st actually, we had William Nylander sign. There's been a lot of talk of Nylander obviously struggling a little bit at first, getting some goals and assists around the All-Star break, and now kind of catching a little bit of a scoring slump again. You see him every game. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is he looks like the real William Nylander again.
Yeah.
And it took longer than he expected, for sure. We're at 28 games now that he's played since his contract standoff ended, and he's been awesome the last, I'd say, 10 games or so. He's been really, really good. It shows he's getting points. He's scored a little bit. The underlying stats, the more advanced numbers, are all very positive for him. And it's amazing. It just shows you, even when you're as young as he is and in as great a shape as he is, missing that amount of time, I think, really had an impact on the start of his season. But I think that there's a lot of positivity around William now with the team and the coaching staff, because they see the guy they thought they were paying.
Yeah.
And obviously what's important for the Leafs is this last stretch of the season and the playoffs and how he performs there. And right now, Nylander's been awesome.
It's just a matter of production, I guess, because getting a couple of goals and assists in a situation like that can obviously, it's what we in Sweden would call the ketchup effect.
Well, it's the skating too. I think for him, he looked a bit slow, which is unusual. I mean, one of the strong points when you watch Nylander play is his ability to skate with the puck, to make entrance into the offensive zone, and that wasn't there. I think his confidence was hurt, and he didn't have that extra conditioning, whatever it is. And it's interesting, when he came back, he took all the skates, even if they were optional. He was skating to get up to speed, and I think that's what's really come through the last few weeks.
We also have Per Lindholm, which is quite an interesting story from a Swedish standpoint, because he's like one of those guys that the Maple Leafs are going to have to find pretty much every year. A free agent signing from Europe, mid to late 20s, and stepping right into the NHL. You've seen him play all the games this year. What does he bring to this Leafs team and the fourth line that he has been leading pretty much all season?
Well, I think what he is exactly as you nail it. He's someone they didn't use a draft pick on, that it costs relatively little money on the salary cap, and he's been an effective player for them. And he's got a big role in the penalty kill. He takes a lot of faceoffs for them on the penalty kill, and he's been in the lineup right from the start of the year. He's never had a spot where the coaching staff was going to take him out, and I think he's just been very, very steady. It's funny, I've been thinking I should ask him if he wants to stay. I don't know what his intentions are, if he wants to remain in Toronto, because he just has the one-year contract. I know he likes the city. He said it's a big adjustment from home, living in the middle of a big city. But he's fit in very nicely on the team, and you're right. Whether it's Per or other players, you're going to see them bringing more guys, I think, from Europe over just to fill spots, because there's only so much money in the salary cap, and it's hard to get those guys that are already here in North America.
Obviously, a lot of interest in Swedish prospects now with the Leafs organization, with the Marlies. And definitely so on the defensive side, because you now have Rasmus Sandin, you have Timothy Liljegren, and you also have Kalle Rosén, who was awarded a one-way contract earlier this year. So he's on the books for next year. Is that because Kalle Rosén will have a role with the Leafs next year, or that they appreciate his efforts with the Marlies?
He'll definitely be with the Leafs. You know, they've seen a lot of growth from him, especially in the playoffs last year with the Toronto Marlies when they won the Calder Cup. And then this season, he's been their #1 defenseman, and he's produced points. He's playing huge minutes, and they love him. And it's funny. I think it took him a little bit of time to adjust to playing in North America. When he first came over, he did get a few games with the Leafs, but I see him as a regular member of the team next year. I think that's how management sees him. You know, things happen, injuries and trades or things, but you know, more than likely, I'd say he's going to be a regular member of the team. And really, he's just playing out maybe even before the end of this season, depending on how things go with the health of their defensemen. You know, Sandin has had an awesome year too. I mean, they're thrilled with that pick. I think he really opened some eyes in training camp. They didn't know he was quite that ready, and you know, obviously those games aren't the same as the real thing, but he was very noticeable at that point. And you know, I might argue in their eyes, he might have surpassed Timothy Liljegren a little bit, even though he's a year younger, just in terms of where they value their prospects. And, you know, I think both those guys are going to get a chance, though, next season. I mean, the Leafs have salary cap nightmare coming up. Yep. They're going to lose Jake Gardiner, I would think, in free agency this summer, potentially Ron Hainsey as well. There's going to be some turnover among those defensemen, and there are spots there. And it'll really come down to training camp for both those guys. And you know, they kind of fall in the same category as Andreas Johnsson in that I don't think either of them will be traded, even though other teams want those prospects, because the Leafs believe they're not that far from being NHL players.
Liljegren is actually an interesting case because he was highly touted leading up to his draft year. Yep. He got mononucleosis in his draft year, missed a lot of games, and fell a little bit in the draft. And now he's been injured again this year. But still, what do you see in his growth? Like, how far away is he? Because he's got a lot of talent, obviously, but how far away from an NHL spot would you say he is? Well,
he's got one great attribute. He shoots right-handed, and he's a defenseman. Yeah. And that's something the Leafs don't have much of. Honestly, among their players under contract for next year, there's one. Nikita Zaitsev is the only other player that does that. So I think the fact that he has that attribute, and obviously he does much more than his handedness, but that helps, you know, pave a way for a chance for him. You know, not very many players come and play in the American Hockey League at his age that are defensemen especially. And so I think relative to where he's at, I mean, that's a man's league. It's a very physical league. You play 3 games in 3 days sometimes. I mean, it's a demanding spot. You know, I think that they're encouraged with where he's at. You know, the one thing I wonder a little bit about Liljegren and speaking to the scouts is what does he do that's amazing? Like, what is his one skill that will define him as an NHL player? And I'm not sure that is evident yet, but he's still so young, and the organization used a high draft pick on him. They like him. I know they were very disappointed. He had the high ankle sprain. He missed the World Junior Championships. At that time, Kyle Dubas actually said their plan was to bring him up to the Leafs before the end of the year, but you know, that setback, I don't see that happening. But he's not far away. He's got a chance just because they need him to. They need him to fill a spot, and if he can do that, you know, we might see him in the NHL next season.
Well, the Stanley Cup draft's been going on for 51 or 52 years now in Toronto. You've seen this team grow from what was basically rubble when it was just blown apart, focusing on talent management, drafting, getting players up to speed. Mike Babcock knew they were going to miss the playoffs his first year there. Been a very patient process. Would you say that they are there now, or?
We're going to find out.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they think they're there, and if you look at where they are in the standings, how much they score, how good Frederik Andersen's been, their #1 goaltender, I think that there's enough there you could see it happening. But they haven't won a playoff round. I was young the last time it happened, frankly. So, you know, you almost don't want to get too far ahead of yourself, because I don't know how far up the mountain they can climb at once, if they can go the whole way. I mean, it's possible. They have as talented of forward group as any team in the league, in my opinion. They don't have any glaring weaknesses. Obviously, their blue line in a perfect world, I think, would be a little better, but there's no perfect team. I mean, Tampa's as close as we have right now in the league to a perfect team. And where that could hurt the Leafs is the way the playoff format works. They're going to play them in round 2 if they get that far. So, you know, they might be unfortunate in their timing in that they're potentially going to have to play the best team in this generation in terms of what we've seen from the Lightning to this point. But I think they're there. And, you know, all their young guys aren't so young anymore. You know, Matthews and Marner, it's their 3rd season in the league. You know, Nylander's played about 4 seasons now in the NHL. These guys know what it takes. They're physically more mature, and you know, I think they're ready to take a step. And if they don't, then there'll be chaos in Toronto, because now the expectations are at a level they haven't been maybe in 50 years. I mean, I think it's the most skilled Leafs team we've seen in that time. Yeah. But skill doesn't always work in hockey. I mean, it's rubber on ice. Weird things happen. The best team doesn't always win.
You obviously move around the team a lot. I mean, you're traveling. You're always at road games and stuff like that. Getting like the Nylander and the Matthews contract talks out of the way, has that kind of cleared the air a little bit? Like,
yeah, everyone was a little bit frustrated. All the reporters, like myself, yeah. I think, especially with Nylander's situation. I mean, it was a major story, and even though the team did pretty well without him there, they were asked about it a lot. I think they'd love to get Mitch Marner's contract done now. It's the last of those 3. I think once that happens, it really removes a lot of those kind of questions and conversations. But it has helped. And, you know, especially getting Matthews done, there's no talk of offer sheets. Everyone knows he's going to be in Toronto for his best years as an NHL player. And I think it's only a matter of time now before he's named the captain of the team. And you know, that's sort of the next step coming. But, you know, they really... It was a distraction. You know, everyone can say it wasn't at the time, but I think if you look back, it was a difficult situation, and not having William for a couple months was hard. But now that it's sorted, you know, all that's left is winning, and we'll see if they can do it.
Thank you very much, Chris Johnston. Always great to meet you. Always good to have you on hockeysverige.se and EP Rinkside. Thank you very much.
Tack så mycket, Sverige.